churn out EVs, but the grid is flickering like a horror movie hallway and water. Ask the people in Materi. Imagine this. It's 3 a.m. You're driving a semi-truck loaded with $2 million worth of high-end electronics. You're on Highway 85 heading north toward the Texas border. To your right, you see the skeletal steel frames of a brand new gigafactory rising out of the dust, a symbol of the future, of money, of the industrial booming beast that is modern Mexico. But then you check your rearview mirror. A black pickup truck with no license plates is flashing its high beams. You know exactly who it is, and you know exactly what they want. In that split second, you're staring at the two faces of the Mexican economy. On one hand, you have the Aztec tiger, a manufacturing juggernaut that is currently eating China's lunch, sucking up billions in foreign investment, and turning the PO into the bodybuilder of global currencies. On the other hand, you have a shadow economy so powerful, so violent, and so deeply embedded in the financial system that economists don't even know how to calculate the GDP without factoring in the business. So, is Mexico about to become the next economic superpower that saves the North American supply chain? Or is it a ticking time bomb waiting to implode under the weight of corruption and cartel governance? Buckle up, amigos, because today we aren't reading the tourist brochure. We are looking at the books. This is the real truth about Mexico's economy. 1. The nearshoring gold rush, or Adios Quinahola Mexico. Let's start with the good news. And honestly, it's really good news. If you've been living under a rock or perhaps in a basement trading crypto, you might have missed the biggest shift in the global economy since the 90s. It's called nearshoring. Here's the deal. For the last 30 years, the global business strategy was simple. Make it in China because it's cheap. Ship it to America because they buy stuff. But then 2020 happened. Supply chains snapped. Then geopolitical tensions got spicy. CEOs suddenly realized that having their entire production line on the other side of the planet, in a country that might invade Taiwan or lock down a city for 3 months on a whim, was a terrible idea. Enter Mexico. Mexico looked at the United States and said, "Hey, remember me? I'm right next door. I have trains, I have a massive workforce, and I'm part of the USMCA Free Trade Agreement." The result of the literal gold rush. As of late 2024 and leading into 2025, Mexico officially overtook China as the top exporter to the United States. Let that sink in. For the first time in 2 decades, the US buys more stuff from its southern neighbor than from the Asian giant. We aren't just talking about cheap plastic toys either. We are talking about high-end manufacturing. The automotive sector is exploding. You've got Tesla, BMW, Audi, and even Chinese companies like BYD rushing to build plants in states like Nuevo León. Why? Because if a Chinese car company builds a car in China and tries to sell it in the US, they get slapped with tariffs. If they build it in Mexico, voila, it's a North American car. This influx of foreign direct investment, FDI, created what economists call the super peso. For a long time, the Mexican peso was the punching bag of emerging market currencies. But recently, it's been hitting the gym. It appreciated massively against the dollar in 2023 and held ground through much of 2024. Defying every expectation. But here is the edgy reality check. While the headlines scream economic miracle, the infrastructure is screaming for help. You have massive factories being built in the north, but they are running out of 2 things: power and water. The electrical grid in Mexico has been underfunded for years. The government, particularly under the previous AMLO administration and continuing into the Shinbal era, has been obsessed with state control over energy, making it hard for private companies to generate their own green power. So, you have these billion-dollar factories ready to churn out EVs, but the grid is flickering like a horror movie hallway and water. In recent years, they faced droughts so severe that taps ran dry, all while massive industrial parks were guzzling millions of liters. The lesson: Mexico has the golden ticket. The world wants to give Mexico its money. But unless they fix the grid and the pipes, that Aztec tiger is going to die of dehydration. Speaking of cars, be honest with me in the comments. Would you buy a Chinese-branded EV if it was made in Mexico, or are you sticking to Ford? Let me know down below. 2. The shadow GDP. Narronomics 1. Now let's turn off the lights and look at the part of the economy that doesn't show up in the official World Bank reports, at least not directly. If you think the cartels are just guys in boots selling white powder, you are living in 1990. Today, Mexican cartels are essentially Fortune 500 conglomerates with a diversified portfolio and a very aggressive HR department. A study released back in 2023 by Science magazine dropped a bombshell. Organized crime in Mexico is the country's fifth largest employer. Let that marinate for a second. They employ more people than OXXO, the massive convenience store chain. We're talking about nearly 175,000 people on the payroll. But here is where it impacts the economy, not just the crime rate. It's called the PO of floor, or the extortion tax. Imagine you're a small business owner. Maybe you own a taco stand, or maybe you run a lemon farm in Michoacán. Every week a guy comes by to collect a security fee. If you pay, you stay open. If you don't, well, you've seen the news. This acts like a massive invisible tax on the entire Mexican economy. It drives up prices for everyone. Take avocados. We love them on toast. We love them in guac. But in states like Michoacán, the cartels control the production cycles. They dictate the price. They take a cut of every truckload. This is often referred to as blood guacamole. When the price of avocados spikes in New York, it's not always because of a drought. Sometimes it's because a cartel dispute closed a highway. And it's not just agriculture. It's construction. It's mining. There are reports of cartels selling stolen fuel to legitimate companies. They call it coal. At one point, theft from PMX, the state oil company, was costing the country billions of dollars a year. The economic paradox here is the dark, twisted truth. This shadow money, it actually floats the economy in some regions. When a cartel boss builds a mansion, he hires local architects. He buys local cement. When the Sicarios' hitmen get paid, they buy trucks, clothes, and beer. There are entire towns where the local economy would collapse overnight if the illicit money stopped flowing. It is a parasitic relationship, but the parasite has become a structural load-bearing pillar. The government knows this. The banks know this. Money laundering is so sophisticated now that the line between narco money and legal money is blurrier than your vision after 5 shots of tequila. So what's the cost? The Institute for Economics and Peace estimates that the economic impact of violence in Mexico is equivalent to roughly 18% to 20% of the country's GDP. Imagine if the US lost 20% of its GDP to gangs. That is the anchor dragging down what should be a rocket ship. You can build all the Tesla factories you want, but if the managers are afraid of being kidnapped on the way to work, your economy has a glass ceiling. 3. The zombie in the room, Pemex. If you want to understand why Mexico's economy gives Wall Street analysts heartburn, you have to meet the elephant in the room. Actually, it's not an elephant. It's a dinosaur. A very sick, very expensive dinosaur. Meet PMX, Petróleo México's. For decades, PMX was the piggy bank of the Mexican government. It paid for schools, hospitals, and highways. It was the pride of the nation, proof that Mexico owned its own resources. But today, PMX is officially the most indebted oil company in the world. We are talking about roughly $100 billion USD in debt. To put that in perspective, PMX owes more money than the entire GDP of Ecuador. Imagine you have a rich uncle. He owns a gold mine. You'd think he'd be a billionaire, right? But instead, he's broke borrowing money from loan sharks to pay the electric bill and hiring 10 people to do a job that takes 1 person. That is PMX. How did this happen? First, the government taxed it to death. For years, instead of letting Pemex reinvest its profits into fixing pipes or finding new oil, the government took almost every cent to balance the federal budget. They treated it like an ATM that never needed a refill. Second, corruption and inefficiency. PMX is bloated. It has strong unions and a history of awarding contracts to friends of friends. While companies like Exxon or Shell became lean, mean drilling machines, Pemex became a bureaucratic nightmare. Here is the kicker. During the AMLO administration and continuing now, the government strategy wasn't let's fix it or let's pivot to green energy. No, the strategy was make oil great again. They poured billions of tax dollars into propping up this zombie. They built a massive new refinery, Dos Bores, which went wildly over budget and behind schedule. Credit rating agencies have downgraded Pemex's debt to junk status. This matters to you because the Mexican government has effectively guaranteed this debt. If Pemex goes bust, the whole country takes the hit. It is the definition of too big to fail. but also too broken to fix. While the rest of the world is racing toward batteries and solar, Mexico is betting the house on a 20th century business model run by a company that loses money when it sells oil. Make it make sense. 4. The other oil remittances and the migration paradox. Okay, let's pivot from the oil coming out of the ground to the oil coming out of Western Union. If I told you that Mexico's biggest safety net wasn't a government program, but a guy named Juan laying drywall in Phoenix, Arizona, would you believe me? Welcome to the economy of remittances. In 2023 and 2024, Mexicans living abroad sent home over $60 billion USD annually. To give you context, that is more money than Mexico makes from agricultural exports. In some years, it rivals the income from oil exports. The government loves to brag about these numbers. Former President AMLO used to stand at his morning press conferences and thank the Peace countrymen for sending record amounts of money, calling them heroes. But hold on, let's look at this with our edgy economic glasses. Celebrating record remittances is like a hospital celebrating that they have record numbers of patients in the ICU. It's verifiable data, sure, but it means something is wrong. High remittances are a sign of failure. It means the domestic economy, the Aztec tiger we talked about earlier, cannot provide enough well-paying jobs for its own people. The Mexican dream is still for millions to leave Mexico. Imagine you're a brilliant young engineer in Oaxaca. You could stay, struggle to find a job, and maybe get extorted by local gangs. Or you could move to Texas, make 10x the salary, and send money home to build your mom a house. What do? You leave. Mexico is exporting its most valuable resource, its young, ambitious workforce. This creates a Dutch disease effect. All these dollars flooding into Mexico strengthen the PO, helping the superpo phenomenon, which sounds great. But a super strong PO makes Mexican exports more expensive and hurts local tourism. A tourist from New York suddenly realizes his carburation costs 20% more than it did 2 years ago. So maybe he goes to the Dominican Republic instead. It's a cruel irony. The heroes sending money home to save their families are accidentally making it harder for local businesses to compete globally. Quick question. Do you think a country can become a first world nation while relying on citizens leaving to send money back? Or is that a permanent trap? Let's argue in the comments. 5. A tale of two Mexicos, North versus South. If you look at national averages, Mexico looks like a middle-income country, but averages lie. If I have 2 chickens and you have none, on average, we both have 1 chicken. But in reality, you are starving, and I'm making nuggets. Mexico is geographically bipolar. The north states like Nuevo León, Baja California, and Chihuahua. This is NAFTA land. It's industrialized, modern, and deeply integrated with the U.S. economy. Wages here are higher. Infrastructure is better, though water is scarce. If you drop someone from Detroit into Monterrey, they'd recognize the strip malls, the factories, and the hustle. This is the Mexico that Tesla and Amazon see. The South, states like Chiapas, Oaxaca, and Guerrero. This is a different world. It is incredibly rich in culture and natural resources, but it is economically isolated. Poverty rates here are double or triple what they are in the North. Most people work in the informal economy, cash only, no taxes, no benefits. For decades, the North pulled ahead while the South stagnated. The recent administration tried to fix this with massive infrastructure projects, most notably the Tren Maya train. The idea: build a pennant-kilometer tourist train loop through the jungle to bring tourist dollars from Cancun deep into the poor southern states. It is an ecological and economic controversy. Environmentalists are screaming because the train cuts through pristine jungle and threatens underground cave systems, see notes. Economists are screaming because the price tag ballooned from $8 billion to nearly $30 billion. It probably won't turn a profit for decades, if ever. So you have the North complaining, we make all the money, pay all the taxes, and the government spends it on a train in the jungle. And you have the South saying, we've been ignored for 100 years. It's our turn. This regional tension is the friction burning under the hood of the Mexican economy. You cannot be a superpower if half your body is sprinting and the other half is paralyzed. 6. The China backdoor and the 2026 ticking clock. If you think the drug war is the only conflict happening on the border, you aren't paying attention to the trade war. Remember earlier when we said Mexico is overtaking China as the US's top trading partner? Well, there is a plot twist. A lot of that Mexican export growth is actually Chinese. It's called transshipment. Here is the play. The US slaps a massive tariff on Chinese steel or EVs. A Chinese company says no problem. They ship the parts to Mexico, screw in the final 3 bolts, call it a Mexican product, and ship it north across the Rio Grande duty-free under the USMCA trade deal. It's the economic equivalent of a Trojan horse. In 2024 alone, Mexico's trade deficit with China exploded to roughly $120 billion. That means Mexico is buying massive amounts of stuff from China, but China isn't buying much from Mexico. Why? Because Mexico is importing the raw materials to assemble goods for the US market. Washington is furious. Both Democrats and Republicans have looked at the numbers and realized they are being played. And this brings us to the scariest date on the Mexican calendar, July 2026. This is when the USMCA, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA, goes up for its first major review. This isn't just a handshake meeting. It is a sunset review. If the US, Canada, and Mexico don't agree to extend the deal, it enters a death spiral that ends in termination. With protectionist sentiments rising in the US, there is a very real chance the US negotiators walk into that room and say, "Kick China out of your factories or we kick you out of our market." For Mexico, the stakes are existential. Their entire nearshoring pitch depends on having tariff-free access to the US. If that goes away, the factories close, the peso crashes, and the Aztec tiger loses its teeth. 7. The informal trap, the tax-free nation. To understand why Mexico is stuck in the middle-income trap, why it can't quite make the jump to becoming a rich nation like South Korea or Japan, you have to look at the guys selling pirated DVDs and knockoff Nikes on the corner. This is the informal economy. And in Mexico, it isn't a side hustle, it is the main event. Let's look at the numbers because they are staggering. According to the ANI and Mexico Statistics Bureau, roughly 55% of the Mexican workforce is informal. Let that sink in. More than half of the people waking up and going to work in Mexico today do not exist on paper. They don't pay income tax, they don't have social security, they don't have pension plans, they deal strictly in cash. The tale of 2 workers. Imagine 2 brothers, Carlos and Juan. Carlos works at a Ford plant in Hermosillo. He makes a decent wage, but the government takes about 30% of his paycheck in taxes. He follows the rules. Juan runs a taco stand and sells gray market electronics in Mexico City. He makes roughly the same amount of cash as Carlos, maybe even more on good days. But Juan pays 0 tax. He keeps everything. In the short term, Juan looks smart. Why give money to a government that might just steal it, right? But here is the economic tragedy. Because Juan and 32 million other people like him don't pay taxes, the Mexican government has the lowest tax to GDP ratio in the OECD. Mexico collects about 16 to 17% of GDP and tax revenue. The US collects 26%, France collects 46%. Why does this matter to the economy? Because the government is perpetually broke. They don't have the money to invest in high-quality education, advanced infrastructure, or a robust police force. It creates a doom loop. The government provides terrible services because they have no money. People refuse to pay taxes because the services are terrible. The government stays broke. Repeat. But there is a second darker layer to the informal trap, the productivity ceiling. A street vendor cannot scale. Juan can't export his tacos to Germany. He can't get a bank loan to buy a robotic tortilla machine because he has no tax returns to show the bank. He is stuck being a micro-business forever. Economists call this the 2-speed economy. Mexico has a Ferrari engine in the north, high-tech aerospace and automotive exports attached to a wagon made of bicycle parts, millions of low-productivity street vendors. You can rev that Ferrari engine all you want. Nearshoring, Tesla, Superpo. But if 55% of your wheels are bicycle tires, you aren't going to win the Formula One race. 8. The rule of law or who owns the referee. If you ask a CEO in New York or London, why aren't you investing more in Mexico? They won't say cartels, they won't say infrastructure, they will say 3 words, rule of law. In economics, certainty is more valuable than gold. If I sign a contract to build a factory, I need to know that the contract is valid for 20 years, no matter who the president is. In Mexico, all bets are off. Let me tell you a horror story that still haunts Wall Street. In 2020, an American company called Constellation Brands, the guys who make Corona beer for the US market, was building a $1.4 billion brewery in the city of Mexico. They had all the permits. They were 70% done with construction. Hundreds of millions of dollars had already been spent. Then President AMLO decided he didn't like it. He claimed it used too much water despite studies showing otherwise. Did he go to court? Did he follow a legal process? No. He held a public consultation, a fake vote where a tiny percentage of the local population showed up, and based on that vote, he canceled the project. Overnight, a $1.4 billion project evaporated. Investors watched this and froze. The message was clear. In Mexico, the president's mood is more powerful than a signed legal contract. Fast forward to 2024 and 2025. The ruling party pushed through a controversial judicial reform. The core idea, electing judges by popular vote. On paper, this sounds democratic. Power to the people. In practice, legal experts and foreign investors are terrified. Why? Because if judges have to campaign for votes, they become politicians. They become beholden to the political party that backs them, or worse, beholden to the dark money groups, cartels that can fund their campaigns. Imagine you're Apple or Google. You get into a legal dispute with a Mexican state-owned company. Do you think an elected judge who needs the ruling party's support to keep his job is going to rule fairly against the government? Absolutely not. The USMCA trade deal requires Mexico to have an independent judiciary. By politicizing the courts, Mexico is technically violating the trade agreement. We are already seeing the consequences. It's called an investment pause. Tesla's gigafactories slow walk. Chinese EV plants delaying announcements. Capital is a coward. It hates risk. And right now, Mexico is shouting, "We are changing the rules of the game while we play it." If Mexico becomes a country where the law is just a suggestion, the nearshoring boom will end not with a bang, but with a quiet exit of capital moving to Vietnam or India. 9. The gringo invasion, gentrification, and the cost of living. We've talked about factories and cartels. Now let's talk about something that is making the locals arguably just as angry. You. Well, maybe not you specifically, but the wave of expats, digital nomads, and remote workers flooding into Mexico's major cities. This is the unexpected side effect of the superpio and the postcoid world. Americans and Europeans realized, wait, I can work from my laptop. Why am I paying $4,000 rent in San Francisco when I could live like a king in Mexico City for $1,500? In neighborhoods like Condesa, Roma, and Palano in Mexico City, rents have doubled or tripled in just a few years. This sounds great for landlords, but it is catastrophic for the local economy. The average Mexican salary is roughly $700 to $1,000 USD per month. When a remote worker comes in willing to pay $2,000 for an apartment, the local family is kicked out. They are pushed to the periphery, to the dangerous outskirts, adding hours to their commute. It's creating a bubble economy within the cities. Prices for food, services, and transport in these expat bubbles are decoupling from the reality of the country. You now have taco spots charging New York prices in a country with developing world wages. This isn't just about money, it's about social friction. You are seeing protests. You're seeing signs in windows telling tourists to leave. You're seeing a rise in anti-American sentiment in places that used to be very welcoming. Locals feel they are being colonized economically. They see their culture being packaged and sold back to them at a premium. And here is the kicker, the currency. Remember the super peso? It made Mexico expensive. For years, Mexico was the cheap option. It isn't anymore. In 2024, Mexico City was ranked as one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in. If you're earning in dollars, this hurts tourism. Why go to Tulum and pay $25 for a cocktail when you can go to Thailand and pay $5? The gentrification crisis is showing the limits of Mexico's growth model. You can import rich foreigners, but if you don't raise the wages of the locals, you just create a theme park for the wealthy surrounded by a sea of poverty. Final thoughts. The verdict, the cliff edge. So let's zoom out. What is the real truth about Mexico's economy? It is a country standing on a razor's edge. On one side, you have the opportunity of the century. Geopolitics has handed Mexico a winning lottery ticket. The US needs a manufacturing partner that isn't China. Mexico has the youth, the location, the industrial base, and the trade deals to become the next global superpower. The Aztec tiger is real, and its claws are sharp. On the other side, you have the anchors. You have a shadow state run by cartels that taxes 20% of the GDP. You have a government that seems intent on dismantling the rule of law and scaring away the very investors they need. You have a water crisis, an energy crisis, and a workforce trapped in the informal cash economy. Mexico is currently the luckiest unlucky country on earth. It keeps surviving despite its best efforts to shoot itself in the foot. The next 3 years leading up to the 2026 USMCA review will determine everything. Will Mexico formalize its economy, fix its courts, and secure its borders? Or will it remain a country of almost, a country where the rich live in fortresses, the poor live in the gray zone, and the potential is always just around the corner but never quite here? Now I turn it over to you. I want you to go to the comments and answer one question. If you were a CEO, would you build your next factory in Mexico or would you skip it and go to Vietnam? Be honest. I'll be reading the replies. If you learned something today, whether it was about the narco tax, the zombie oil company, or why your rent in Mexico City is so high, hit that subscribe button. We are decoding the global economy one disaster at a time. This is Chill Financial Historian. I'll see you in the next.